and Dr. Ide. They're going to talk about the Unitarian Universalist Church in Valdosta and beyond. So thank you very much, and we are all ears to learn from both of you.
Hi, well, first, just thank you so much for inviting us. It's always a pleasure to connect with students, and we were chatting last night about how great this opportunity is just personally to review some of our own history and think about our community in a deeper way as we're coming back out of pandemic times and looking toward the future. So I am Dr. Carl Ide. I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociology instructor at South Georgia State College. And with the Unitarian Church, I am the secretary of our board. I've been a member for about 3 or 4 years now, and I'm basically secretary of our CUPS organization as well, which is the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. So yeah, my remarks today are primarily on the broad history of Unitarian Universalism, and then Kimberly will be focusing more on the local history and how we've translated that and localized that here in South Georgia. My talk it raises a question, and it's a question that I still don't fully understand, which is how two Christian denominations really came together to form a post-Christian faith, a post-Christian religion. And we'll get into sort of what that means for the UUA. But let's start with, well, there's Unitarianism and Universalism. I'll start with Unitarianism because it's the first one in the name, Unitarian-Universalist. So Unitarianism really goes back to the earliest times of the Christian Church, and it's the idea. Well, basically, it's contrasted to Trinitarianism, the idea that God is three persons and in one being. Unitarians have rejected that idea, and they tend to see Jesus more as a prophet, actually in some ways similar to how Jesus is viewed within Islam, as a prophet or as a great teacher, or even as the Son of God, but not of one substance with God the Father. And at the Council of Nicaea, the Orthodox position was created, and that was Trinitarianism. And since then, the Unitarian position has, for the most part, been a heterodox or heretical position in relation to Christianity, but there have always been Unitarians out there. Some take an adoptionist view, which is the idea that God the Father adopted Christ at his baptism by John the Baptist, and others see Jesus in a variety of ways, but not co-substantial with God the Father. As one example of this that we tend to point to, not quite as ancient, but that's Michael Servetus in the 1500s, who was a Unitarian, and he came to Unitarianism in the upheavals of the Protestant Reformations, and his very close reading of the Bible and understanding of the Bible. And like Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists today tend to do, he really stuck to his convictions despite it being unpopular at a time when unpopular could mean death. And he was actually killed for heresy. And Calvin of the Calvinist faith was part of that story, a pretty central part of that story. Even in what is now the land that we call the United States, Unitarianism has a lot of overlap with deism and theism that was relatively popular among the more educated classes of the founders and sort of the late colonial period. And Unitarianism was the driving force, or a driving force within Harvard Divinity School, really for the first 100 years of the history of that institution. Now, New England, a lot of the churches still today, but historically, were part of the Congregationalist movement. And one of the things that means is that congregations themselves were the primary authority. And so there was perhaps some more diversity in Christian thought than we might imagine at this point in time. And some of that diversity was around the question of Trinitarianism or Universalism. Unitarianism versus Trinitarianism. And this really came to a head in the Second Great Awakening, roughly 1975 to 1835, which was a Calvinist revival. And Unitarianism became sort of a bit of a pariah through that movement and sort of had to come out of the closet a little bit. It was pulled into this upsurge of the revival, and in some ways that made the distinction much clearer. Within that period, the American Unitarian Association was founded in 1825, and it held to rationalism, Enlightenment ideas. Emerson and some of the early transcendentalists were connected to Unitarianism at that point. And I think in some way it's sensible in the idea that if Jesus was, let's say, a prophet or a great person, that it's someone that we can aspire to. So it really feeds into the idea of progress and personal responsibility, rather than sort of laying the burden of life onto a divine figure. And I think that's kind of how it played out in some of that history. And then another brief historical note, a Unitarian minister named Starr King was largely influential in helping to secure California for the Union and not the Confederacy during the Civil War. And one of our seminaries is named after him. The seminary in Berkeley, UU Seminary today, was founded in 1904. So that's Unitarianism, roughly. And now we'll talk about, slightly more briefly, Universalism and then the merger and what has come out of that. So Universalism, another minority tendency or heretical tendency or heterodox tendency within Christianity. And again, it seems like there are some ancient Christian writers who at least flirted with the idea of universalism. And that idea is that everyone is saved. Within the Christian context, is the idea that Christ dying meant everyone is saved. Everyone from, Martin Luther King, or the people that we put up on pedestals, to the worst people. That there is no hell, there is no everlasting punishment, that salvation is actually universal. It took on a couple of different forms. Some sort of took on the idea of purgatory, that the bad people would go to purgatory and they would have their badness sort of, whipped out of them, and then they would get to heaven, or a more sort of hardline position that you die, you go to heaven, end of story. We're all going to be in heaven together. Universalism tended to be more of a working class movement and tended to be much more popular out on the frontier as European Christian communities were spreading, versus Unitarianism, which tended to have its stronghold historically in the Northeast. So the Universalist Church of America was founded in 1793, and it tied in with a lot of Universalist movements happening throughout Europe, within the other Christian churches, especially in Germany. But Universalism didn't coalesce in quite the same way as Universalism didn't coalesce in quite the same way as Unitarianism, but it peaked as a major force of early American Christianity, especially in the early 1800s, Universalism was not as marginalized as it has been in other periods. As sort of a brief personal note, I came to Universalism myself long before I even knew what Unitarian Universalism was, and it was sort of one of my breakthroughs. I was raised very mainstream Protestant evangelical Christian, and through my own biblical study, especially Matthew 18:21, which is where Peter comes to Jesus in the New Testament and says, how often should we forgive our brothers if they sin against us? And Jesus's response is basically, 7 times 70, or just, as many times as it takes. And I had a personal revelation at that time for my own faith that oh, well, if Jesus is saying we should forgive other people all the time, it doesn't make any sense that at death it's the end of the line and God can't forgive us for whatever we've done. So yeah, I became a Universalist even when I was still a Christian, and I wonder, within the history of it, how many people who on the outside might appear very orthodox actually reverberate some with the Universalist message. So the Unitarian Universalist Association was the merging of the Unitarian Association in 1960. And what came out of this was not just a new Christian denomination, but a whole new religion that is welcoming of Christianity, but is not defined by Christianity. So Unitarian Universalism has no creed. We don't have anything that people have to believe to be welcomed into the faith, but we do have a set of principles that we expect our members to aspire to. The first being the inherent worth and dignity of every person, then justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Third, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Then a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Then the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. 6 is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And the 7th is respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. And there's a movement within Unitarian Universalism today to add an eighth principle, which is building a multicultural, beloved community by dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. And that comes out of the Black Unitarian Universalist organization that we have as sort of an internal part of the faith. And then, in addition to our principles, we have some official wisdom traditions that we draw on. I'll list those off real quick. The first is the direct experience of transcendent experience. Second is prophets who call on society to transform in accordance with love and justice. Third is the wisdom of world religions. Fourth, going off of that, is Jewish and Christian teachings. Then we have humanist teachings. And finally, we have earth-centered traditions. So we draw on a wide variety of resources in line with the principles that I laid out. Now, this could be seen as sort of a grab bag or sort of an anything goes, and that's a critique of Unitarian Universalism. But for me, what separates that out is, well, the principles, first off, and also, it sort of, for me, ties into the idea of like spiritual versus religious, and that we, as Unitarian Universalists, many of us are spiritual, but we're religious in the sense that we come together in community and building organizations, and it's not a fully individualistic pursuit, that we're calling on one another to help us to reach our highest our highest aspirations spiritually or ethically. So even today, there are groups within Unitarian Universalism. There's the UU Christian Fellowship for Christians who are Unitarian Universalists, UU for Jewish Awareness, the UU Buddhist Fellowship, Sangha. There's CUPS, the Unitarian Universalist Pagans. There's the UU Humanist Associations and Atheists and Agnostic Unitarian Universalists. So they all organize with sort of internally within their faith or ethical traditions, and then are part of the larger community. And yeah, so that's sort of where we are today. We have churches and fellowships also throughout the United States and in some other countries, and we have some organizational and cultural affiliations with Unitarians and Universalists around the world as well. So with that being said, sort of an overview and introduction of Unitarianism and Universalism, and then bringing that together into what it has become today, I will turn it over to President Tanner, and she'll tell us a little bit more about how that's really manifested in our local community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, and publicly thank you for your leadership for the UU Church of Valdosta. You've just been a joy to work with, and we're so fortunate to have you and your family as part of our larger UU family. So thank you so much. I'm going to pick up shortly after the Unitarian and Universalist merged, which was again in 1961, and tell you a little bit about where our local church got started, and then the way that we live out our faith and our principles that Carl shared. So if you think about the mid 1960s, we know that the civil rights work was underway for many years then, and Unitarian Universalists were very active in the civil rights group. Of course, they didn't run anything. It wasn't their leadership. But when Dr. King called on all ministers and people of faith to support the efforts, Unitarian Universalists did answer that call. UUism wasn't huge in the South at that time. Some might argue it wasn't huge now, but like Carl mentioned, it really started up in the New England area. But we did have people from all over the country coming to work with Dr. King, who answered his call. So in particular, if you think about the march, Selma to Montgomery, which ended up with Bloody Sunday, there were two people who joined in from the Unitarian Universalist faith who essentially became, I guess, sort of the first two martyrs of UUism. One was Reverend James Reeb, and he was a UU minister in the Boston area. And he had come down and he was dining with some other ministers one night while they were trying to get across the bridge, and they were eating at one of the only integrated restaurants. And when he left with a couple other ministers, he was attacked and actually injured, so that he ended up dying a couple of years later. He had a family and I think 4 children. That were left after that. And of course, so many people died then. These are just 2 UU folks that we look to. The other was a recent member to the Unitarian Universalist faith. Her name was Viola Liuzzo, and she was from Detroit at the time. And she was a mom and was attending a UU church and just said, you know, I can't just sit here and not do something. So she went down to Alabama and worked with registration, however she could help. And unfortunately, she was transporting people to and from the airport. And one of those trips ended where some members of the KKK shot her while she was at a red light, I believe, driving her car. So that's happening in 1965 in Alabama. And then we come to, okay, that same year in Valdosta is when our local story starts. Now, I haven't been able to make any particular connection to the events that were going on in Selma to the start of our fellowship. But during that year, Bud Evans and Mary Louise DeWolf Hunt organized a meeting, and it actually was held at the Daniel Ashley Hotel. And I don't know if you know, but it's now like the Ashley, I think it's an older folks home downtown. And they had a meeting of like-minded people at that hotel. They were members of the larger church fellowship, which is basically, it started in the 40s before UU and still continues today, but it's basically providing ministry to people, isolated UUs. So people who might not have a UU church in their community or surrounding community. And so I think the timing more was that we had people who landed here because of Moody Air Force Base and wanted to create a group of people who thought the same that they did. They had 30 people at that very first informational meeting, which is, I don't know, Carl, it blows my mind because when we get 30 people at church, we're like, woohoo, this is great. So having 30 people at that first meeting was definitely a sign that something needed to happen in our community. So those people got together, and on December 12th, 1965, they had 14 charter members, and they submitted an application to the Unitarian-Universalist Association, which is our overarching association located in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was accepted in early 1966. So that's 1965-66 is where our story begins. And it's interesting because it was the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Valdosta. Technically, we are still the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Valdosta. And that is a common, it's common among churches in our area. But later we started referring to ourselves as a church. I think when we got some space sort of nailed down, and I think it has helped us to bridge the divide between our fellowship and other churches, because there was a time, and for some people, I don't know that they have always considered us similar to their churches. So something I thought was interesting when I was looking into our history is where we met, like our buildings and meeting places. We're kind of all over the place. We met at that hotel. We rented a women's building, a women's club building. The church met at individual people's homes. In 69, for a couple of years, we rented a building on Blanton Street. I think we should maybe do a tour, Carl, have everyone tour all the places, because I think that would be really cool. Finally, we purchased a home on Mary Street near the university. And in 1982, we moved to a building on Ashley Street, and it was actually the old St. John Catholic Church. And that might be when we started calling ourselves a church out in the community. In 95, though, is when our church purchased land on Park Avenue, where we currently still are there. We were under the brilliant architectural vision of one of those charter members from 1965, Jim Ingram, and he and his wife are still members of the Unitarian Church. And if you have not been out there, our space is beautiful. Our little church in the woods, and we have a fire pit and a labyrinth and a nature trail, although it hasn't been, nothing's been done with that since COVID. So spiders, I wouldn't walk through there, but you're welcome to visit our property if you'd ever like to see it. We're very, very proud of it. But why is that important when I talk about the history is, to me, it's all about the people. It's not about a building, right? So we've been around since 65, and it wasn't till almost more than 30 years later that we had our permanent space. It's always been about the people. But now that we got our permanent home, I also feel, to me, I joined around 2005, and I feel like our building is really a sanctuary. And that's become one of our strengths. I think that we are sanctuary physically. Our sanctuary is a beautiful place that can take care of people, but also our church, one of our most important achievements and goals and things that we still aspire to do better and better is to be a sanctuary for people in our community who otherwise don't have one. So, as an example, we have supported other churches who didn't have a space, who could use our church, and we're still offering that to this day. We've sponsored a lot of activities and groups that didn't have a place or weren't welcome in other places. Let me just give you some of those. And it's been so fun preparing for this because I get to study all of the newsletters from like ever. And so some of the places that we provide sanctuary, just a small list. PFLAG, and that's Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gays, which is still active. There's not an active group in Valdosta at this time, but if it starts up again, we are there for them to hold their meetings. South Georgia Pride, to this day, can use our space for meetings and social activities. We've done annual rainbow mixers in cooperation with South Georgia Pride. We've also gotten involved with being sponsors of Pride festivals. You name it, we've done it. We'll always be there for that group. We've had survivors of suicide support, HIV support group. We host Buddhist meditation. Any group that needs a space that doesn't have one, I think we know what that's been like. So we're always there for them. So let me tell you, I will get back a little bit later to some of the highlights that we've had. But I wanted to tell you, it wasn't just our space that was constantly evolving and changing. It was also our ministerial leadership. And this is not uncommon in UU churches, and it might be really unique for people who aren't familiar. But when they started out, this charter group, they were lay-led for many years before they had a minister who had a connection with the church directly. They would have ministers as guest speakers. They would get a lot of people from the university setting and the community to be speakers. So we started off lay-led, and over the years, we've had our first official minister was in 1981. They were part-time from Tallahassee. Then from 92 to 99, we had a ministerial intern, Reverend Jack Ford, who I believe now is in the St. Augustine area. So in 2002, so it was 3 years later, we had another minister for a year, and then a different minister, 2004, 2005, Reverend Child, then Jane Page. So, and none of these people were full-time. So that's just, again, it's not unusual in a Unitarian Universalist church. Most recently, though, Reverend Dr. Fred Howard was our part-time minister from 2009 until 2018. And he also, for a year or two, had Reverend Benny Calloway assisting with that. So he would come twice a month, and the other times we would fill with community members, our own members who had expertise in different areas. And after he left, we have been lay-led since. It doesn't mean, again, we don't have ministers. We have a retired minister, George Bennett, who leads a lot of our RE, adult religious education classes. We've got a progressive Baptist minister, Anna Hall, Reverend Dr. Anna Hall, who was a member of the UU before she relocated and became a minister herself. And then we have had regular speakers from the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department. Dr. Cristobal has spoken with us many times on such fantastic topics. Currently, since COVID, we have gone online with Unitarian-Universalist Fellowship of Gainesville, and they have a full-time minister, Dr. Christy Lunsford, and they are a full-time minister, and next week will be installed as an official Unitarian minister, not just an intern. So we're a group of us are going to celebrate their installment. It should be very exciting, and the first time I've been able to be at one. So one of the things that Reverend Fred Howard brought to our church is a concept that's very familiar at UU churches, which is share the plate. And we are a very small group, and we are not a very wealthy church. And so when he said there's this thing that people do, and if you have an offering every week, once a month, that offering goes to an organization in the community. And I remember I was like, how are we we're barely making ends meet with, keeping the lights on and the building together. And, he asked us to have faith. And I remember thinking, okay, and it has been one of the greatest things that I'm so proud of, because it is about social justice. Unitarian Universalism is about living those principles that Carl shared. And, how does a small group like us do that work? There's only so many of us. So what we do is we support other organizations in our community and beyond who are doing the work, and we can give them support to keep doing. So I've made a list of some of the regular groups that we support. And I will say that during the pandemic, even though we didn't have a lot of money coming in because we weren't meeting, the board was committed, no matter what, we are going to make sure we keep supporting these organizations. And so I think that at the heart of the matter, that is who UUs are. It's about supporting our communities, doing the good work. So we were a founding member of LAC, which was Lowndes Area. I did not write down what that stood for. But it was support of local people who needed funds, and the ministers would be able to use those funds and distribute them to people in hard times. We were founding members of the Lowndes Associated Ministries to the People, called LAMP. We've been doing break bread delivery since 1966 with other churches. We support Sister to Sister Summit with the American Association of University Women. We support Habitat and have always participated in Blitz builds. We supported South Georgia Migrant Farm Workers Clinic, the Partnership to End Homelessness, Hope and Dreams Riding Facility, Rotary Club, Imagination Library, the Meeting Place too. We helped raise their roof for homeless and most vulnerable women in our community to have a safe place. Also the Haven, Southside Recreation Center. We've supported their community harvest dinners. We also did a lot of work with South Georgia Immigrant Support Network, which really in 2018, we did a lot of work. We did letter writing to the people who were being imprisoned because of their immigrant status, which I don't know if you're familiar, but that was happening in Georgia. There was an ICE facility a couple hours away. The partnership to end homelessness, we've done bags throughout. And I'm not saying this to pat our own backs. It's just to demonstrate that we are about living our faith and acting on our faith. And so those are some of the ways that we do that. Couple of highlights. We are a welcoming congregation. And in Unitarian Universalism, that doesn't mean we just say, welcome, we want you all to come. Being a welcoming congregation is work, and you have to apply for the status, and you have to get your congregation ready. And we did trainings and movies and guest speakers on issues of oppression in our community. And we had a lot of speakers on trans issues and white supremacy. And then once you get that status, once you earn that status, you have to keep doing the work and resubmitting. So we're really, really proud of that. Oh, I did write it down. LAC was Lowndes Area Crisis Care. Sorry about that. I knew I wrote it somewhere. So let's see. We also participate in the Universalist Service Committee, helping to fund their initiatives around the world. So right now they're working very closely with groups in the Ukraine, for example. So our pennies, sending our pennies to Ukraine isn't necessarily going to make a big difference, but because we have groups like the USC who can take that and put it together and make it really make a big impact is how we do our small part. We do have religious education for our children as well as adults. And I love our leader of RE says things like, we're going to study the great religions. And what does that mean? And the kids all say, big. And so they learn about lots of different religions through our religious education program. One of the sad points in our history in 2003 was when our beautiful church was terribly vandalized. And it was before my time. I came a couple years later. But it was wonderful because this church that was sort of aside from all the other churches had people from all different places and walks of life in our community come in and help us to repair and rebuild. And so many people sent us money so that when our insurance paid for the damage, we had a fund that we created, the Accepting Differences Project, now named after Dr. Betty Derrick, one of our early members. And we use that to fund a lot of the work. So we're continually adding to that and doing the work to honor different cultures in our community. We team up with different churches. Serenity Christian Church, we every year until the pandemic, for several years, we've done a shared service with them where we go to their church and then they come to ours and we have lunch together. And I'm looking forward to getting back and doing some of those things that we haven't been able to do for a couple of years now. So lots to tell you about, too much really for just a short time. I will say quickly, during COVID, we've continued to meet online. We have ongoing conversation series on racism. We've like How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi, and have attended some of his trainings or panels, excuse me. We have a Soul Matters sharing group that meets monthly. We have a meditation group that meets weekly. And again, our share the plate is probably one of the most important things that we've continued throughout COVID pandemic and beyond. I think that that's probably plenty of information in addition to what Carl shared. Cristobal, I don't know if you want to open up for questions or discussion. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to both of you for such a wonderful overview of the history of the Unitarian-Universalist Church, and for you, Kim, to also cover what you are doing here in the local area and the history of the church in Valdosta and beyond. In regards to the names of founders, are there any official founders of the Unitarian Universalist Church or not at all?
I don't know. There are certain names that we refer to, like Michael Savitas. And then there was a history of Moravians in Transylvania that are credited a lot of times with sort of the beginning of what ends up being Unitarian Universalist. But again, since it was several religions, I don't think any one person in their group takes credit for the merger. I don't know, Carl, did you ever hear about anyone sort of saying, yes, I created Unitarian Universalism?
Oh, I got stuck on mute somehow.
There you go.
No, I think your understanding is the same as mine. We do point to historic examples of Unitarians and Universalists, especially those that were involved in work and scholarship that still resonates with Unitarian Universalists today. We have specific aspects of our faith that we can point to certain founders of. So at the beginning of our liturgical year, we have a flower communion, or actually the water communion is at the beginning of the liturgical year. At some point in our calendar, we have a flower communion, which goes back to a Unitarian minister, Norbert Čapek, in Prague, who was murdered by the Nazi regime for his Unitarianism. And so we have sort of ancestors, but not, as I understand it, a specific founder.
Yeah, and we refer to prophetic people, which Carl talked about, for example, the Transcendentalists. So we look to a lot of these people in our history and learn from a lot of these people.
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up with this question about about the Transcendentalists, I have read, of course, about Emerson and Thoreau and the Alcott, and all of them were, of course, living in Concord, in Massachusetts. I used to live not far away, so I used to visit them very often. But in regards to the controversy surrounding Emerson became very involved in the community, but at some point he had trouble with the organized congregation there. So can you say a little bit about what were some of the major problems that Emerson faced with his own congregation?
Well, I'm going to say, Cristobal, the funny thing about my path to Unitarian Universalism is I grew up outside of Boston and somehow missed the boat. So it wasn't until I came to Valdosta that I found Unitarian Universalism. In the center of my little town, not too far from Concord, we had a congregational church and we'd host events there with the Girl Scouts, but I never found Unitarian Universalism until I moved down south. And I'm not specifically familiar with Emerson's conflicts, but Unitarian Universalist folks aren't strangers to conflict and speaking their mind and coming from unique places and beliefs. Carl, I don't know if you have anything more specific about that question exactly.
Yep. So my understanding is that Emerson was a Unitarian minister, and sort of just got fed up with the organization, sort of seeing the rituals that were part of services as sort of not really in touch with spirit, just sort of going through the motions. Yeah, I'm having trouble remembering the details of the story, but perhaps he didn't want to do something that his congregation expected him to do as far as their liturgy, and he ended up splitting off from there. It does seem to me that maybe even still today, that the churches in the Northeast and on the East Coast might be a little bit sort of closer to Christian orthodoxy, or have more connections with Christianity, and as you go out west, it becomes sort of more interfaith. I don't have a sociological data on that. That's just from traveling around. I've been a member or regular attendee of about 6 different Unitarian congregations, and I've chatted with other UUs who seem to have sort of a similar impression there. So maybe if he had gone out west, he would have stayed with the Unitarians. I don't know.
Thank you. And yes, Steve is raising his hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is sort of a question, my personal curiosity here. My baby sister, got married in a Unitarian church in the early 70s. And at that time, we just all referred to it as the Unitarian Church. After that merger and the corporate merger, was that a total merger in the early 60s, or were there still some, strictly Unitarian and some strictly Universalist churches, or did everything change for all of them, and we just used the shortened name? I never heard her call it anything except the Unitarian Church. And I was always attracted to it because we liked the interfaith. I was there in the 60s, and we liked the interfaith thing, and we're a little suspicious of all you guys from Berkeley and stuff. But that I only knew it as the Unitarian Church, and they were separate entities. So you're saying that they did all merge in the 60s?
There was a merger of the 2 religious groups, but even our church, again, we refer to ourselves as the UU Church of Valdosta, but we're actually officially a fellowship. The church that I referred to in Massachusetts is still the Congregational Church. So when that merger happened, there wasn't this, okay, everyone has to change their name. So there is still a lot of individual responsibility on churches, and they're run independently. We do pay a fee to be part of our Unitarian-Universalist Association, and we have regional groups that are available to us if we need support. We have a General Assembly meeting every year, which is attended by people from all over the country and beyond. But Unitarian Universalism is about as unique as its members.
That's really, to me,
in my experience,
because I think that embodies a little more of the ideals of understanding the principles behind Christianity generally, instead of the official rules of this, the secret handshake of this particular church or something.
Right.
Getting away from the principles. So I'm going to log off and listen to the rest of it here, because I know we kind of run short of bandwidth sometimes. I'm really enjoying this, and thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
Thank you for having us, Steve. You made me think of something that I wanted to share. I've got 40 pages of notes in front of me because I have just fallen into our history. It's been fantastic. But one thing that I was hoping to mention, I did talk about South Georgia Pride and how we support that entity. One of the really cool things is we worked really hard to support the right of the freedom to marry. And when the Supreme Court approved supported the freedom to marry, we were the first. We held a wedding ceremony that day on the steps of the Valdosta courthouse. with two of our regular attendees, and we weren't the first to. They weren't the first to fill out a marriage certificate, but they were the first to have a marriage ceremony. And our minister, Dr. Fred Howard at the time, married them on the steps of the old courthouse in Valdosta. And it was, I think every member and friend of the Unitarian Church was there for the rally and the celebration. It was just one of my favorite days in all the time that I've been in Valdosta. So your sister's wedding reminded me of that really awesome, great experience.
Thank you. And Ian, our president may have maybe a comment or a question. So are you still there?
I do. Firstly, I want to say thank you to both of you for sharing your time with us today and giving a very insightful discussion. And I only had one question, and it was, do you have any literature that you would recommend reading? I like that face.
Okay, literature that you would recommend reading. Well, if you would like, we do have sort of introduction to UUism books that we give people who come new to our church, and they're small, really concise. But if you'd like, Ian, I can get some of those to you if we want to figure that out. The UUA website, I think, is a really great resource because they have sermons. They just collect everything, and they have a lot of resources to those prophetic people and texts. There is a UUA bookstore, which is amazing. That's where we got our books, and we have brochures and pamphlets and things at the church that we give to people who are coming in. So if there's anything in particular that you need, let me know and I can try and get that for you. But I think those are probably the UA bookstore, and the UA is a good place to start. Carl?
Yeah, I was trying to look at my bookshelf to see if I had the pocket guide on this bookshelf or another one. It's somewhere else. In general, yeah, I can't think of specific titles, but the UUA does have its own press called Beacon Press.
Yes.
And so anything that's produced by Beacon Press or anything that you find on their website would be great. And then it just sort of depends on what you're looking for. You can find lists online of like famous Unitarian Universalists, and some of them are authors, and so that could be one way of going. One of them is Kurt Vonnegut, so if you're into Vonnegut, then you're already reading a Unitarian. And so yeah, I wish I had a list that would actually be really fun, Kimberly, to put together, like a recommended reading. But the books that we read and are engaged with in our study, in our sort of small group study, let's see, we did the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then what else did we do in that series, Kimberly? What other books?
Oh, well, we did some movies. We combined books with movies in that conversation. So we watched Ava DuVernay's 13th. We did so many things. It's hard to think of them now. We watched Just Mercy with Brian Stevenson. Amazing work. And then in our history, we've had a book club for years and years. And so I've been collecting that information too. And depending on what we were working on, like we did Redefining Realness by Janet Mock to learn about her experience as a trans person. We did A Backpack, a Bear, and 8 Crates of Vodka, which is a great book about Jewish family immigrating to the U.S. and Lolita in Tehran and House of Sand and Fog. And so when we look at books or movies, we're not necessarily going, okay, we need a book by a Unitarian or a movie by a Unitarian. We want to get books on topics that are, will stir our humanity and get great discussions like Philomena and Awakenings, and Dear White People was a really good movie that we watched and had quite excellent discussion after that as a group of we are diverse, but not near diverse as we would like to be. So it's really important that that when we're welcoming, we're not just like, hey, come on in and act and look like we do, and everything will be fine, right? It's about our church be changing and becoming better when we have diverse people with diverse experiences, and we learn from diverse writers and directors and artists and authors. And so it was probably more than you wanted, Ian.
I think it was just perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, my experience of attending the Unitarian Universalist Church here in Valdosta and in other places where I live in Illinois, I used to go to Bloomington Normal, and they invited me also to give a talk, is that oftentimes the majority of members, in my own experience, have been professors, scholars, intellectuals, people who are more rationalists in some ways. So they make the service be less resemblance of what you find in a Catholic church or in a Baptist church, and more appealing to people who have a more sort of not academic per se, but more intellectual search that is linked to a spiritual hunger for something
Yes.
that maybe they don't even know. And that has been my experience, that it really attracts people, especially from universities and colleges and from intellectuals. So I think it's true in most congregations, don't you think?
I do agree. I think we struggle sometimes with that, Cristobal, because sometimes we get too much in our head, and so it's always we have to work to connect those things. So I'm thinking about Dr. Marks, plural. Dr. Marks, Dennis Marks speaks regularly, and he's a retired physicist from Valdosta State, and his talks are just sometimes a little over my head, but he talks about how the universe is always expanding. It freaks me out, but he brings it down to this level and says, so you know what this means? We have all these possibilities in our future. And I'm like, how did you get from the universe is growing exponentially to individually we each have the opportunity to create our own future? And it's mind-blowing, but he does a great job of connecting the head with the spirit. And so we struggle sometimes because we want to make sure that anyone who comes in feels comfortable. We don't always have physicists who are talking to us, but so we try and diversify the speakers that we have to make sure that we always try and connect those, and that we don't stay too much in our head. Crystal, I love what you said about sort of touching that person's hunger and what they're looking for, because it's a struggle, but we enjoy the struggle.
Definitely. And to follow up on that, yeah, y'all might have noticed when Kimberly was introducing several people, there were lots of doctor sort of sprinkled in there.
Yes.
Our board is 6 people. 3 of us have doctorates. 1 of us has a master's. And even the liturgical calendar that I mentioned earlier, the start of that is like the start of the academic semester and goes with the academic semester. And, I think at its best, higher education is training us to ask questions and to be okay with ambiguity and to search and to dig for answers and to not be comfortable with sort of simple answers that we all just agree on just out of the need to agree. in any academic discipline, it's driven by arguments and disagreements, civil disagreements, but a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. And I think that's one reason that highly educated, formally educated people are often overrepresented in our congregations. One of the churches that I attended, maybe was a member of, I forget, but I used to joke that it was just like the social hour for the biology department at the local flagship institution. And yeah, I think those of us who are specifically trained and devoted to asking big questions, and when we get to the point where it goes from answer to mystery, and that we're comfortable with that mystery, that UUism is a very comfortable place to be. That said, there's a group called Unitarian-Universalists for Class Awareness, and trying to address classism within Unitarian Universalism, that can be an issue, because it can be very comfortable for those of us with a lot of academic background and formal training, and whenever you get a group of people that becomes more and more homogenous, sometimes that can be more and more alienating to other people. And so that is, I would say, one of the struggles of diversity within the faith, really at like the largest level and locally.
So thank you very much to everyone. We are almost getting there to the end of our session and the academic year, and talking about liturgy. This is our moment to say thank you to our two presenters today, to Dr. Ide and to Dr. Tanner, for your wonderful presentation and your hospitality, and also for your clear messages that you are getting from the principles of your church, your history, and what the wonderful job that you do, even on a small scale in Valdosta and in Georgia. Your contributions of faith in action are really important. This is actually, I think, the most important thing that any person of faith can do, to bring that element of faith into action into your everyday life. And without action, we cannot really be good people of faith, because by their fruits you will know them. So I commend you for your work as a community and for opening that sacred space and sanctuary for people of faith and no faith at all. By the way, I don't know if you mentioned during your presentation that there are many atheists and agnostics who also attend your services, and they feel welcome by you because they have been ostracized or marginalized in other sectors of society. But this is really a place where almost anyone can feel at home and feel that they can voice their opinions or their religious sentiments or feelings. So highly recommended. Even though I know the Unitarian Universalist Church member, when I was raised Catholic, I have to commend you for your work.
Thank you. And thank you for being part of our work and helping us to learn from your experience and knowledge.
And thank you, Ian, for being the president of our club this year. Thank you to Steve for being such a wonderful secretary. And thank you to all of you for attending this event. I'm pretty sure many people are busy with final papers and exams, and they will probably hear your presentation via YouTube. So thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful day.
Good luck, everyone.
Have a safe day.
Study hard.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye. Thank you, Cristobal. And can you